This is a production of Cornell University.
All right. Well, I want to welcome everyone to Hemp 411. We are, as always, so thrilled to be here, and we're thrilled that y'all made a little bit of time to come today. It's going to be a really good one. I can promise you that. So my name is Zachary Stansel, and I am the USDA Hemp Germplasm Curator. So I wanted to tell y'all a little bit about some of the work we're doing in beautiful Geneva, New York, which is snowing again today. So my team and I run a hemp germplasm repository. So it's basically a seed bank for genetically and geographically diverse hemp varieties. Not unlike a library, we maintain this very unique, large collection of hemp materials. We study them, we keep them safe long-term in a minus 20 degrees Celsius cold storage area, and we enable scientists to use those seeds for their various projects. For example, breeding a different variety of fiber hemp for a unique environment, or understanding the genetic control of a certain trait of interest. Those are all kinds of people that would use our resources that we keep. And then secondly, we're trying to help preserve this genetic diversity long-term. So thinking, in the scale of 100 years or more, can we preserve these cool varieties of hemp for future generations? So it's a big job, it's exciting, and we're really just now starting it. So we hope that this work will allow universities, farmers, hemp businesses, all to kind of get a boost from having access to unique hemp. While doing this work, we were thrilled to meet so many awesome people in cannabis research and business, and we thought it would be really fun to share their knowledge with all of y'all. So I do want to thank George, Tony, our wonderful interpreters, Kim and Gemma, for doing a lot of work. I'm just kind of the person that talks here, but absolutely most of all, I wanted to thank Alisia Ratliff. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about her and then let her take over. So Alisia Ratliff is a fast-moving consumer goods executive with a background in chemical sciences and an interest in carbon sequestration, employed within the cannabis industry. With over 15 years of leadership experience across several sectors, Alisia uses a breadth of technical knowledge to build startup companies, develop strategic direction, and sustain the brand in new emerging markets. She is esteemed as a technical conference speaker, author, and ambitious entrepreneur who has become a technical subject matter expert, global thought leader, and motivational speaker. She strives to advise businesses on best practices, helping them avoid failing business models and implementing sustainable policies within an ever-changing regulatory environment and alternative medicines marketplace. So buckle up, and here she goes.
Thank you so much, Zach. Thank you, Tony. I'd like to thank Dr. Grab and our relationship that we have for just, introducing me to such a wonderful group of people that would invite me to be a part of something I think is so important and big. So hello, everyone. Thank you for taking your time out today to spend with me and just learning a little bit about extraction chemistry and facility design. So I'm going to share my screen here and go right into the presentation, and hopefully we'll end up here with a few minutes for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So thank you so much. So today we're going to talk about extraction chemistry and facility design. Specifically, when I was talking over, my part in coming into the series, we were discussing some of the things that were of interest of some of the students over at Cornell University and in the Hemp Sciences program. And one of those things that came about was, learning how to build and think about and operate a successful cannabis extraction company. So that is what I'm here to talk to you guys about this afternoon. Hopefully I can convey some things that will shed some light to how extraction chemistry is deeply intertwined with the facility design and success of a company. So just to give you a little bit of background about myself, my background is in chemistry. I graduated from the University of North Florida a few years back, and I have worked in the traditional laboratory setting for the past few years. I'm also a licensed project manager. I took on a role later on in my career to where I came outside of the laboratory and really started to develop a lot of the business acumen skills, and just took an interest in understanding how the scientific aspect of testing was, affecting scope of projects and different things like that. So I also took an interest in logistics and supply chain management. I'm professionally designated in those skill sets as well. I run a consulting firm with my husband, Victus Consulting Ventures, where we are industry consultants and advisors, basically helping new licensees in new markets really develop their strategic goals for building their infrastructure, understanding their product development, and launching those operations in the new markets. I've also been a scientific executive in the industry where I've held multiple roles, gaining experience with startup companies in the US, the Canadian, and the UK markets. So again, thank you to Cornell and the USDA for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this series. You guys have heard some amazing webinars now about cultivation, processing systems, and what I will be talking about, I think, is a really great transition from all of those topics. So again, we're going to touch on extraction chemistry and facility design. But specifically, we're going to be discussing building a cannabis manufacturing site, what goes into that, some of the considerations that you need to think about, looking at extraction facility design, looking at the extraction chemistry itself, some of the mechanisms and methodologies that are used in the industry commonly. Then we'll talk about, product development and quality and compliance and how all of that ties into your manufacturing plant. Then we'll get into some of the products that can come out of these facilities, and then hopefully end in enough time to answer a few of your questions. All right, so let's jump in. So when you're building a cannabis manufacturing facility, there's a lot of things that you need to think about when you go into the strategic planning phase, which should be the very beginning of the project. So, one of the things that you have to decide early on is, what is the level of compliance that I'm seeking as my standard? One of the things of why I say, what is the level that I'm seeking? When the industry got started, especially in newer markets, there isn't really a standardized level of compliance across the globe for this emerging industry. So a lot of states will have their own representation in legislation of what's considered compliant for your facility. So you need to have a good understanding of what that is, and then decide for yourself, am I going to essentially just meet state requirements, or will I be the person that's going to exceed those state requirements in order to impress and really differentiate my product in the market? So that's one of the first things. One of the second things is, what market am I targeting to start a business? Am I targeting a market that is, flooded with vape products? Is that something that I want to do? Do I want to just be a cultivator that is generating B2B ingredients of cannabinoids, oils, and things like that? There's all these different ways that you can build an intermediary business like a manufacturing facility. You just have to figure out what it is you want to do early on so you can plan those things out. What type of licensing am I seeking? This is very important. There's markets in the states that have, vertical licensing, where you have to own every single entity that's involved in producing the product and selling it, from cultivation, manufacturing, dispensing, All of those different things fall under your umbrella, versus some markets have a horizontal structure where you can essentially buy into just being a processor, and you have contracts set up with farms where you import your biomass, you extract, you create product, you white label, whatever it is you do there, and then you're able to distribute that into the market, whether that's through wholesale channels or a consumer brand. So there's different types of licenses, and so you have to understand what your license is giving you to operate in that market. And then some of the subsets of what you should really start to think about after those major points has been really decided is setting the bar for your budget, really understanding, how much money do I need to fund the startup of this operation? How much money do I need to develop a product? How much money do I need to sustain operations for X amount of years before we think about our next fundraise? These are things that you need to take into account because it'll give you that operating runway. Understanding all of your considerations that go into building a site. We're going to discuss these in detail here in a little bit. Being honest with yourself and realistic. I have encountered multiple companies that come into the cannabis industry with just dollar signs in their eyes, and understanding that this is going to be keys given to them to unlock revenue in the billions. But you have to be realistic in what goes on in this industry as far as the research and development that goes on in the product development, optimization of processes, the training of staff, just different regulatory changes that will affect what you do as a company. So these things you have to take into account. And finally, know the impacts that your investment are going to have to the operation and the products overall. So this is a slide that I really love to show because it just gives an average of budgets and budgetary concerns, and just having cost considerations at the beginning of your planning phase. The assumption that I used here when I built this was 2,000 square foot horizontally licensed manufacturing facility that operated using CO2 extraction technology. So when you're building up your budget of the project and what you're going to need to, get this thing operational, then you have to look at, okay, I've got to get a property and building. I've got to have some sort of planning and design strategy that may involve a team or hiring, startup founders. I need equipment to produce this product. I'm going to need software to stay compliant and show transparent results of what we're doing at our facility to the state. I'm going to have, technicians or employees. I'm going to have operating costs, your electrical, your cooling, water. So all of those things need to go into the considerations of what is the cost of, just the build out of the infrastructure to be able to produce the product. Some of the next things that you need to think about with facility design considerations are going to be the building itself. And the materials that go into the building. Am I going to construct this from ground zero, or am I going to buy a pre-existing building and retrofit and make sure that it's the appropriate environments for what I would be doing in those rooms? Those are things that you have to take into account because they're going to affect your budget and your timeline as well. Facility square footage. This is something that sometimes people fail to consider, future proofing. So you may have a predictable facility square footage of what you foresee, or you may have a pre-existing plot of land and building that you're using that you're pretty much married to. However, I think you should consider the facility square footage for success. Plan to be successful, plan to have expansion, plan to add different revenue streams and activities to your facility. I think those things are important in the mindset of just building a successful business. So definitely consider future-proofing your infrastructure with the facility square footage. Also, you need to consider the electrical requirements from the equipment that you'll be placing, the plumbing, the HVAC for being able to circulate the vapors and mitigate odors. These things need to be taken into consideration, and especially your location of where you're deciding to build. You have to look at the accessibility as well of these outputs that are going to be going into your facility design. So do I have access to the appropriate electrical that I need to run the facility? Do I have access to plumbing? All these different things have to go into your decision making. And finally, your zoning. Where can I build this facility facility and stay within compliance. Usually each state market has its own, spiel on where you can be located, whether that's 1,000 feet outside of school zones, parks where children would be. So know your municipality, know where you're going to be building so that you don't have to waste time in remediation of a site. Also, another consideration in facility design, especially if you're horizontally licensed as a processor, is thinking about your compliance strategy. Knowing that you have a set of standards set out by the state that you have to stay compliant to in order to operate, you definitely should think about your testing strategy. How am I going to ensure this compliance and be able to relate and report this to the state or to the government agency that's covering me? So you definitely want to think about that. What is your strategy? Are you going to be doing in-house testing, or will you have third-party testing? I think it's important to do a cost analysis. Sometimes it may be a little bit more effective to send your samples out if you don't have a high traffic of sending samples to an analytical testing lab, and you can afford the turnaround times. But then in other cases, it's best to have your own in-house capabilities, even if it's as small as just having an HPLC to be able to have eyes on what is actually the composition of the product. What are some of the test methods that are needed in the facility to support production? You might need to have some sort of method to test the optimization of what you're doing. Are you efficiently extracting the material? Are you wasting? So these are things that you have to consider. And also consider what that's going to do to your budget and also to the people that will be involved in the project. Have you considered specific technical laboratory staff? So these are things that also should be considered going into your facility design. This is extremely important to me. Growing up in laboratories and working for traditional laboratories, something that is very near and dear to me is safety. It's pretty much like knowing the right hand of me. You have to regard safety of everyone involved, whether that's the consumer on the back end or the employee that's producing your product. So when you're talking about your design of your facility and building this manufacturing facility, you have to consider your extraction technology and what you'll be doing to generate the oils out of the plants. Are you going to be using hydrocarbon extraction? If you are, then now you have to build your facility to a C1D1 environment, which is a class 1 division 1 solvent, meaning that it's highly explosive. So there's other considerations, other types of protocols that have to be put in place to be able to mitigate against an incident in where there would be an explosion. So that's a safety consideration. Also PPE. What sort of PPE am I going to mandate in my facility to not only adhere to compliance of safety of product, but also to keep my employees safe? If they're operating a CO2 extractor, do they have hearing protection for the pumps? Do they have safety goggles if they're operating a distillation apparatus? So these things you have to consider. Also, the environment itself and sanitizing the environment. How are you going to control the environment? How are you going to handle waste that's generated? You'll have spent biomass that you have to destroy. You'll have oil that may somehow pick up contamination that you have to destroy or remediate. How are you going to handle this waste? Who are you going to partner with to destroy it? And also chemical storage. Since it is a processing facility, sometimes there's chemicals involved that could be toxic to the environment or to people. So you have to think about the storage and also disposal and management of chemicals as well. And something that we do need to touch on now, I think that's so much more prevalent than it was a decade ago, is the conversation around climate change and really starting to work those details of sustainability and reversing a carbon impact into the design of a facility. Some of the data that has come out from mature markets in California and Colorado have shown that manufacturing facilities and extraction plants have a very high energy demand. They can have a high carbon emission rate or a large carbon footprint, and also generate large amounts of waste. So I think it's important that we think about some of the things that we can implement into future facilities to be able to mitigate some of these factors and drive a net zero strategy for the business. So kind of pivoting here and just kind of understanding chemistry and cannabinoid extraction chemistry, I like to kind of take it back to the historical terms and, what things were back in the ancient times. So what is botanical extraction? Botanical extraction is placing a solid in a solvent in order to remove soluble, dissolvable components. So we've seen this, across the industry in multiple methods and techniques and pieces of equipment, which we'll talk about here in later slides. Plants, they've been found historically over centuries to provide therapeutic properties. So a lot of why botanicals have started to become extracts was to dissolve these plants in solutions to concentrate those properties in the compounds that we were extracting out, to separate those medicinal analytes from the plant matrix and really develop, further drugs. So I think it's quite interesting that the natural extracts have been used as active ingredients in both, pharmaceutical applications, but also cosmetics and wellness products for thousands of years before we've even, come to the point we're at now. So some of the things that you have to think about when you talk about a manufacturing facility and extraction facility is the extraction chemistry itself. The process of separating a substance from a matrix is the definition of extraction. There's several types of extraction mechanisms that can be used to facilitate this process. You have liquid extraction, solid phase extraction, acid-base extraction, and also supercritical fluid extraction. Specifically, two of these mechanisms are very common in this industry, and we'll discuss those here in a little bit. So here's some of the common methodologies that are used in the cannabis and hemp industry. You have the hydrocarbon extraction, which is using a butane or a propane as a solvent. This is extremely popular. It was first regarded as extremely unsafe and very dangerous due to its popularity in the West Coast very early on when the industry was growing. However, we've become very sophisticated. The manufacturers of closed loop systems have become very sophisticated in how butane is stored, handled, and used within the extraction process. That has made it a lot more safe. It has its advantages in the industry as being a solvent that is highly selective in bringing out, the terpenes. It's able to retain terpenes. It's kind of like a low and slow extraction. So it's a low extraction as far as boiling points and things like that. So you're able to increase your run times, and you're able to increase your yields. So this definitely has its place in the industry, and I like seeing the innovation and automation that's been coming about with the equipment. Supercritical CO2, this is not new technology. It's been used for many years with distillation and removing ingredients from botanicals. But supercritical CO2 is very good at selectivity, and also it's a natural solvent. So when it's being purged, it's essentially like effervescing into the atmosphere safely. So it has its advantages with the safety aspect and the component of purgeability out of the product. Definitely a high capex cost in equipment, but with a lot more manufacturers starting to come online, it's starting to drive that cost down to a more reasonable state. You do have ethanol extraction as well. Ethanol extraction is interesting because as a solvent, it has the ability to be both polar and non-polar, so it can extract essentially anything from the plant. It does have its disadvantages in that you have quite a bit of post-processing on the back end of the oils from just different less desirable components and compounds that you don't want in your final product. But it definitely has its place in being able to extract very large amounts of hemp and cannabis at very fast rates. And then you have ice water extractions. This is commonly known as your solventless extractions in the industry, although from a chemical standpoint, it would be just less appropriate for me to refer to ice water extractions as solventless because water is a solvent. However, these are becoming much more popular as well because of the inherent dangers and risks of residual solvents in products. So the consumers have started to show an interest in the craft product production of concentrates through using an ice water extraction and pressing. So that is becoming a lot more popular, and it's also becoming popular in the fact that it drives the cost of construction down because there's no specific environment that you have to work within as far as safety regulations go. And it's also very inexpensive to outfit. The kit is very inexpensive compared to some of the costs of like your supercritical CO2 fluid equipment. So this is definitely something that's gaining a lot of popularity in the industry. So just kind of coming out of the extraction piece, that's just the beginning of the manufacturing plant. Now you have to think of, how am I going to develop and produce all of the products in my portfolio? Am I producing vape cartridges, tincture oils, edibles, whatever that looks like, you have a process. So I like to show this process flow because this is going to affect your budget with ancillary equipment and subsequent manufacturing equipment, software, just all sorts of different things. So you have to think of the process of having the biomass and the contracts set up in place, having your extraction technology. How are you going to winterize? What is your strategy for winterization? How are you going to filter and de-wax if you're using ethanol extraction? Decarboxylation to activate the THC in your cannabis products. And then finally, how are you further concentrating or isolating products if you're an ingredient manufacturer? So these are things that you have to be cognizant of when you're thinking about your sellable product to the market. So talking about the products now being produced in your manufacturing facility, there's a quality threshold and a product specification that's put out through the state market that you're operating in or whatever country you're operating in. So there's regulatory compliance considerations that are now starting to bring their way into the design of the facility. What is your testing program? Are you going to have that internal testing program where you have in-house capabilities that are just confirmed and checked by a third party? Or will you be doing everything externally through a third-party partner? That's something that you have to consider because it will affect your budget and your personnel. Also, GDP, making sure that you communicate and put in place good documentation practices all across the organization. This is the only way that you'll be able to really check the pulse of how the business is doing once you're operating and able to find those areas that you can improve, optimize, and really shave down waste generation. Your equipment materials. This plays a role in being able to satisfy a food safety or GMP sort of standard, depending on what market you're in. So you definitely want to look at the equipment materials that are in contact with your product. Again, going back to environmental controls and sanitation. How am I sanitizing the environment between batches, between days and crews? You need to make sure that you have those things in place as well. And optimizing your processes. How are you going to do that? Are you going to scale up and have more pieces of equipment and expand? Are you going to automate processes? These are things that will also future-proof your business for plans of expansion. So why is testing needed in the cannabis industry? Well, one of the reasons why testing is needed in the industry is first and foremost to test the chemical makeup of the material of the product. This is something that HPLC has been really great at achieving with cannabinoid potency methods being developed from multiple manufacturers as well as product manufacturers. So you definitely want to have testing that's involved at your facility so that you can just test your products and see what's in it and where you're at. Also, the presence and detection of contamination is important just from a compliance standpoint, safety standpoint. You don't want to sell product that you unwillingly know is laden with microbials. So you definitely need to have a testing strategy in place to be able to confirm and mitigate any presence and detection of contamination. Regulatory compliance. Usually every market will have some sort of standard for testing, whether that's holding you to a standard internally or externally. So you have to make sure you incorporate testing to have the regulatory compliance box checked. And also product and consumer safety, as we talked about, making sure that you're being completely transparent with what you're selling to your consumer and having that door open to where they can double check and look through data and metrics to say, okay, this does confirm what the packaging or the label has claimed. So just to give you an idea of what a consumer would see, here's a summarized COA. This is basically giving the potency, what the percentage of THC is in the product, who prepared it, what the terpene profile is, and the contaminant analysis shows whether or not it's passing or failing for heavy metals, pesticides, mycotoxins, and microbials. These tests have become standard in the industry. You'll usually see these across a COA. You don't necessarily have to have a full panel in your testing package, but this is usually typical of a final product before it's sold in a dispensary. You also have detailed COAs, and these are my personal favorite because, I like to get a little nerdy with the numbers and just really enjoy seeing if there's any trends in data that I can kind of monitor to see if there's anything you need to put in place early on for any contaminant spikes. So a detailed COA is going to give you things like an image of the product that's being tested. In this example, they're testing flour. So you have a picture of the flour there. You have safety check, which includes certain analyses. Then you have your cannabinoid content, graphs. You have specific concentrations and how those work up against the method LODs. So this is a very detailed COA. This is something that essentially a consumer, this might be overwhelming to them, but for a product manufacturer, this is very informative for process and for what's being performed. So the necessity of the compliance piece is extremely important, and it's connected. It's interconnected with the facility design and how you're going to run the business. A lot of how your business model is going to be drafted and planned is essentially given to you through the standards of the state market that you're working within, or the regulatory agency of your country. So there's no guesswork there, which is nice. But you do have to put in your own pieces to make sure that you're granting consumer and employee safety at a high priority, that you're following all of your licensing requirements to keep your CO and make sure that you stay operational. You're in continuous production and you don't have pitfalls and equipment breakdowns frequently because you've already planned for those risk factors. And you have a very safe and sanitized environment that you're controlling your product within. So compliance is extremely necessary to the success of starting up and operating a manufacturing business. Also, compliance is important because you're building trust with others. You're also avoiding criminal charges because you're staying compliant within your licensing requirements. You're avoiding fees, penalties, being shut down, having products recalled. These things can be detrimental to a startup company. You're improving your public relations by being transparent with your product and providing consumers with the information that they need to make an informed decision between brands. You're also attracting and keeping the right talent to produce the product for you because you're also transparent to your staff and making sure they understand your priorities in quality and safety. You're also reducing any unforced errors. So you don't want to have the redundancy of having to go back and remediate and fix every 5 seconds you run into a challenge. So now that we've kind of discussed facility design, a bit of extraction chemistry and technology, how that all kind of flows into manufacturing a product to sell into the market, this leads into operating a successful cannabis manufacturing business. All of these different pillars that we discussed. So let's look at the products that can unlock the doors of revenue for your newly formed company that you now understand exactly how to operate compliantly, legally, and hopefully profitably. So I know that we're talking about a cannabis manufacturing plant, which usually is a middleman to cultivators and the dispensaries. However, I just really love paying homage to the flower. The flower is where it all begins. This is where a lot of the cannabinoids and the therapeutic benefits, belong. And this is why we've all jumped into the industry. So I love showing the product of flower because this is the input into all of the infused cannabis products that hopefully you'll be making out of your facility. Here's some of the most common infused cannabis products in the market. I would say a lot of these common infused cannabis products, now that I've worked in several markets globally, this is definitely on the North American side. The North American market is very mature as to where cannabis products are now becoming a lot more commoditized. You're having a lot more companies that are going public. So it's just a different environment compared to like the UK, Europe, who are now starting up and just really starting to navigate how they want to build the regulatory environments. So these infused products go really beyond this list, but some of the common ones that you'll see are like tincture oils. The tincture oils are very common in epileptic patients, in children. Tincture oils are really good for people who really crave that discretion in consuming cannabis products. Vape cartridges, these are becoming extremely common and popular. Even though we had the issue of the vape crisis with, some really illicit things being used as filling agents in vape carts, I think it was a wake-up call to several industries to just really understand the product quality piece and the consumer safety piece. So you're starting to see a lot of innovation in the formulas for the vape cartridges, which is exciting. In medical markets and some adults, you have capsules being produced alongside edibles. The edibles are really, you're starting to see a big jump in edibles across markets in their innovation and the changes. You used to have just gummies and chocolates, but now you're starting to see gummies, chocolates, granolas, fruit bars. There's just all sorts of things. So that's pretty cool. And then concentrates. Concentrates are for, in my opinion, the more sophisticated cannabis connoisseur that needs something that's going to be a little bit more potent. Typically, your concentrate products are going to be higher than 70% of your active ingredient, whether that's CBD concentrate or THC concentrate. So these are interesting, but these are actually starting to gain a lot of traction in the market with popularity as well because of the artisanal production of a lot of the concentrates and being able to do that with a lot of solventless methods. So it makes them extremely safe as well. And a lot of consumers have said concentrates are the closest picture to the cannabinoid profile of the original flower biomass. So that's extremely important to just kind of note. And just kind of digging in with the concentrate product variety, there's, obviously rosin, resin, shatters, waxes, butters, crumbles. These things are evolving in the industry as well. And I really love talking about some of the novel products too. The innovation of this industry and having a lot of people involved from multidisciplinary backgrounds is really starting to show in the research and development of product formulations and the applications of products. So now you're starting to see novel products pop up in the wellness industry through the form of topicals. You have infused shampoos and conditioners. You have all sorts of things now in the wellness industry. You have sexual health products that are now starting to be developed in an infused manner. You have beverages, transdermal patches, sublingual sprays. I read a study the other day about eye drops being developed to help with glaucoma patients, and then cosmetics. So there are so many different things that are being developed in this industry. And the fun thing about product development, if you're, really focused on developing a cannabis manufacturing or extraction facility, then you have the ultimate opportunity to be able to really penetrate the market with something that's a little bit more niche or something that's differentiated, oldie but goodie. But that's the cool thing about understanding the extraction chemistry and product development alongside operating a compliant facility. So thank you very, very much, everyone, for joining me this afternoon for a quick blurb about extraction chemistry, facility design, product development, and what can come out of that facility. And I just really hope you were able to take away a few things. As you can see, my contact information is listed here on this last slide. You can reach me by email, website. We're on Instagram, LinkedIn as well. But thank you very much for your attention. And I'm going to turn it over to open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Zach, did you want to say something?
No, just that was mind-blowing. Thank you, Alisia.
Oh, thank you so much.
I'll just remind all of our participants, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. You can find that at the center of the bottom of your screen, and then I'll work through as many as I can in the next 15 or 20 minutes here. Alrighty, so our first question, could you elaborate on what HPLC is and maybe how it's used in the industry?
Sure. So HPLC is considered high pressure liquid chromatography. You also have UHPLCs, which are ultra high pressure liquid chromatography. That's just a mechanism for separation. So HPLC is an instrument that's used in the analytical laboratories to essentially separate your cannabinoid content from the product matrix and give you an accurate quantitation based on standards. So it's a piece of equipment that is extremely common across the industry in order to test for potency and product composition.
Awesome. Our next question is about what people can do with spent hemp biomass, presumably after it's extracted.
Sure. That's a really good question. And honestly, that depends on where you are. Some markets will allow you to essentially have your own waste management plan and you submit that. And as long as you're adhering to that, it's fine. But there's also other markets that will dictate you have to incinerate or you have to compost it or, just anything like that. So it just really depends, but I would say some of the common ways of just disposal of spent material has been, like I said, having a contract with a disposal company that gets rid of it for you, having some sort of incineration technique, or being able to reuse that in your crop cultivation.
Awesome. We have another question about are there different kind of testing requirements for hemp versus THC cannabis in different states? And I guess, do you think that hemp should be regulated or tested as heavily as high THC cannabis?
Oh, that's a good question. So from a scientific standpoint, there is no difference between the analytical methodology that's used for the potency for the cannabinoid profile of hemp and the cannabinoid profile of cannabis. It's the same exact method that you run to be able to tell you what that potency is. So there is no difference there. I would say the only difference of what you're looking for, though, has to do with the legislation and the regulations. So with the hemp industry, if you're working in a hemp market, then you're subjected to biomass that's no higher than 0.3%. That's in the States, though, by the way, because I have worked in multiple markets. So like in the UK, it's 0.2%. It's just different across places in Europe. So just knowing what your threshold is if you're in a hemp industry, and then you can put into place how to harvest properly or cultivate towards those limits. But there really is no difference. And then as far as the testing regime, one, I'm going to always be on the side of rigorous testing because it's going to keep the consumer safe. For me as a producer, if there's an audit every week of someone coming in and just essentially checking the temperature of my facility, as a consumer of my product, I want that. I want to know that you're going through all these random inspections to make sure you're keeping me safe. So I definitely think that we have to have rigorous testing in the industry. But I don't think that we're to the point just educationally that we understand what it is we're testing for and what's considered legal and illegal. I think the lines are very blurred there at this moment in our political landscape. And I think until we define what's being considered illegal and legal, whether it's cannabis as the plant or whether that's actual THC, CBD, then it's going to be very hard to be able to tell in the future how the testing strategy of whatever market or government you're operating in is going to look like.
Awesome. Can you make a comparison of different extraction methods with regards to which is the healthiest to consume?
Oh, sure. So there's a lot of studies out there show, one, the purgeability of solvents from cannabis products and related matrices. It also shows, just how that removability affects the product. So I'm sorry, can you just repeat that one more time? I start to answer these things and I have a train of thought.
Yeah, different methods and which ones might be healthier or less healthy.
Right. So that all depends again on the purgeability of the solvent. So a lot of consumers have said, and I'm going to say this from a consumer standpoint of research, but a lot of consumers really enjoy CO2 extracts because of the natural effervescence of CO2 from a product. It will naturally purge itself. And it's also not considered toxic. And then, when it comes to other products, as far as consumption, as long as they're within the specifications that are laid out within your regulatory market as being considered safe, there are quite a few solvents that are they're called GRAS solvents, GRAS, which are generally recognized as safe solvents. So as long as you have them below exposure limits, below those permissible limits to toxic exposure, then you should be okay with any product of how it's being extracted, as long as that's being purged properly.
Great. Another question. To what extent are you finding individual growers or farms building on-site extraction or processing facilities?
Well, it depends. It depends on budget, and then it depends on experience. There are some people who have the budget and they've experienced having challenges with biomass being contaminated when they receive it, having to remediate those things within their facility before they can sell a product, and then obviously that taps into profits. So those scenarios, I would say that at a rapid pace, those people are considering cultivation licenses so they can start vertically integrating to control their supply chain as much as possible. But then on the flip side, you would say there's people that just aren't attracted to that model because of the ongoing implications of having now a secondary business that's attached to your primary business. It has its own risk, its own operation and overhead costs and things like that. So it really just depends on your scenario and what you're doing. But there's definitely just it's not a one size fits all industry, which is kind of nice. So you do see quite a few scenarios playing out in multiple markets.
Awesome. Another question. What are the best home testing products on the market at present?
Oh, that's a great question. And honestly, I wish I could answer it thoroughly. However, I have not delved into the home testing products. In my opinion, I'm just such a skeptic of, the quick, scan and you'll give me 50% THC in my product type products. But I just don't have enough knowledge around the subject to just give an informed answer. But I definitely think if it's using robust technology, if you can, do your due diligence on the equipment to, just confirm that it does what it does and there's some accuracy there, then I would say that's a development that has a lot of traction for the future.
Awesome. There's a couple questions about the difference between Delta 8 and Delta 9 THC. If you could touch on that.
Sure. So the difference between Delta 8 and Delta 9 is a little bit of the psychoactivity and how it binds to the receptors in the endocannabinoid system and how long that binding lasts, so what the effects are. So I would say those are the biggest differences between Delta 8 and Delta 9. Again, it depends on your individual cannabinoid system to say which one is more psychoactive versus the other. Some people have reported that they don't feel a difference. It feels like CBD to them. Some people have said that it's more psychoactive than Delta 9, but that's all obviously dependent upon your own unique cannabinoid system. But for the most part, just structurally, the differences are the psychoactivity levels, how it binds, and how long those bindings interact.
Great. Another question. What innovations do you see coming for cannabis extracts? Also, what would you personally like to see in the market that you haven't seen just yet?
Oh, so some of the innovations that I see coming in the market have been around automation, honestly. A lot of the demand of the market and a lot of these markets opening up globally, it's really starting to show that startup companies in the beginning may have thought that their market size was a certain way, but now they're starting to see that that demand is high. So I think there's such an opportunity for innovation just on the scale up piece of being able to produce at higher volumes and still keep that craft quality that a lot of sophisticated cannabis connoisseurs love. And I definitely think there's some innovation around product formulations as well. Something that I would really love to see would be a lot more products formulated around women's health. There's definitely a lot more conversations that are being had around women's health and pain with menstruation, different things with sexual health. So it would be nice to see research going in that direction and really starting to revolutionize that type of medicine.
Another question. With regard to sustainability and specifically energy consumption, have you encountered any extraction facilities that are already running off of 100% clean or renewable energy? How realistic is it to achieve this level of sustainability considering the typical energy demands of these facilities?
Sure. So no, I have not encountered a facility just yet that is just 100% sustainable and renewable energy. However, I definitely think that that's something that is achievable, but I think it's going to take some time, and it's going to take multiple partners collaborating around the world. It's going to take the partners that obviously have the funding to be able to, put those infrastructures in place for their facility, but it's also going to take the development and the data and actually testing those methods to see if it's working and how it's affecting yields of crops and things like that. So I don't think we're quite there yet in the conversation to be able to produce real world data, but I definitely think there are firms across the world that are working towards that goal.
Awesome. Another question kind of on that line, when it comes to product design, do you feel like more products should or could be designed to minimize their waste?
That's a really, really great question. And yes, I do. So kind of coming back to vape carts, just to bring that example, when you're using a filler or a cutting agent, you're introducing another ingredient into the formula. So by cutting out the any type of cutting agents that are coming into the formula and just using cannabis oil, terpenes, and just different, mixes of those, I think right there you cut out waste and you're able to operate your line a little bit more lean. You've just cut out an ingredient, you've cut out any type of issues with packaging as far as that ingredient goes and having to store it. So there's just a lot of ways that you can kind of think about innovating on a lean way and optimizing those processes from that standpoint.
We have a question about CO2 dissipating from products after extraction and whether people have looked at whether it dissipates or it degrades into oxygen and carbon monoxide.
That's quite interesting. I have not heard about that study or research, but definitely would be looking into that. From what I understand, I haven't seen, I've been in the industry for 6 years and I haven't really seen anything come about as far as CO2 extracts having any undesirables and on the back end. But yeah, I'd be interested in any type of study that's showing any sort of risk factors.
Can solvents degrade over time and or reduce the amount of cannabinoids extracted from the plant?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things I can say about that, as far as an example, when you're using ethanol, for instance, so ethanol obviously has a proofing, and you can have 200 proof ethanol, and that 200 proof ethanol can lose its proofing over time, especially if it's open container to the environment. If it's collecting any moisture, then it's going to start to degrade. So you definitely have to keep an eye on that. Test your solvents regularly to just keep that into compliance. And also too, if you're recycling solvents, so if you're recycling CO2 in a closed loop system or even ethanol extraction, you have to look at how many times you're saturating that solvent upon recycling of use. So that will also start to degrade the solvent and reduce the tunability of what it can select and actually extract out.
Can you talk about what distinguishes a botanical extract from a botanical infusion? Apparently, some states there are different licenses.
Yes, so that's a great question. So a botanical extract, remember, we're using a solvent to essentially pull the analytes out of the plant matrix. So a botanical extract is essentially taking the buds and passing it through the CO2, and then now you have your cannabinoids in there. An infusion is taking the cannabis oils or the cannabinoids and actually infusing those into a matrix. So I would say they're kind of opposite mechanisms. You have infusion, which is bringing it into a matrix, and then you have your botanical extraction, which is taking them out of a matrix.
Awesome. Another question on spent hemp biomass. What is being discussed in terms of use for food and or animal food?
Oh, so that's interesting. There's a little bit of research being done in the States. There's also research being done over in Europe regarding animal feed and being able to pelletize hemp, spent hemp biomass. For a lot of the researchers, what they're looking at is going to be, one, the solvent that was used, because they have to check that it's under a certain permissible level, obviously, for ingestion of the animals. So that's going to take some time. And then, obviously, the stability. and making sure that those proteins stay active for the animals. So I know there's studies around the animal feed piece. There's definitely studies being done also around animal bedding, because hemp has shown to be a great odor mitigator. It's highly absorbent without the odors, similar to hay, but just a little bit more effective. So there's studies around that as well. I think probably in the next couple of years, we'll start to see some provisional licenses or research companies coming out with different innovative ways of applying it.
What considerations would you suggest with regards to GMP standards for facility design?
So again, I'm a lab rat, so I'm always going to say high quality, high consideration of safety. So when it comes to GMP standards, I definitely think that if you can afford to outfit your facility to meet the highest standards, whether that's, if you're in the States, 210, 211, if you're in, Europe, it's EU GMP. But if you can meet the highest level of standard, I think you should go for that every time, because again, just kind of taking off the hat of entrepreneur capitalist, you have to think this is a product that I'm putting into the market for potentially children to consume, or immunocompromised elderly people to consume. So you do have to have a bit of a conscience there.
Could you talk about baseline cost approximations, comparing different extraction methods, kind of generally what would be more or less expensive in regards to equipment?
Sure. So I've done a presentation before speaking about extraction equipment and what the pricing has been. And I can say just historically, when you're looking at high CapEx costs, usually your supercritical fluid CO2 is going to be at the top of the list. One of the reasons is behind, the pumps that are needed, the condensers that are needed to recycle the solvent. You have just the pure scale of a lot of the CO2 instruments and the pressure ratings that you're using when you're in service. So the safety implications, there's a lot there that you have to consider. So that's usually the highest cost. On the lower end is usually the ethanol equipment. The ethanol equipment is usually the lower end of the scale. And we're talking, I've seen pieces of equipment as cheap as 75,000 up to maybe like 135 for an extractor, and then those are easily scalable. And then with CO2 equipment, you're talking anywhere from 125 to $500,000, depending on the capacity of your extraction vessel. And then hydrocarbon extractors, I would say, fall towards the lower end of the CapEx budget, and I do think it's because of their not so high desirability when it comes to the safety piece, but also because it's highly scalable too, similar to the ethanol equipment. So, and then solventless equipment is obviously at the very lowest end of the rung, because you're talking about maybe a 5-gallon bucket and you're throwing a bunch of bud inside with a shovel and you're mixing it around. No, I'm just kidding. That was 5 years ago. But now we're talking about just these like wash vessels with, paddle mixers, a rosin press. So it's not anything that's sophisticated technologically. So it's going to be a bit cheaper.
So we're coming up on the end of the hour. Do we have time for one more, or should we just give her a huge round of applause for
I think that the questions have put her through the ringer already.
Congratulations to our guests for coming up with a lot of awesome questions and ideas as well.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it. I had so much fun. This was extremely interactive, and I just really hope someone in the audience was able to take something away. I think our purpose in this part of the industry with all of these opportunities is each one teach one. And if we can lift someone else up and just push them in a forward direction, then we're doing our jobs.
Wow. Awesome. Hey, thank you all so much for coming here today, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.